So, when I first started working on this issue of climate change and peace and security 18 years ago, climate and environment was very much seen as an environmental issue, something, something for the left, something for the green folk. But finally, things are changing. In the past couple of years, climate and its centrality to human security is increasingly acknowledged amongst the security community. Just last week, I was running a training with NATO member states and NATO mission troops to understand how climate change is affecting its mission in Iraq. It was just last week also a topic for the UN Security Council, so the highest body for addressing security issues internationally. So it's no longer just something on the side, an environmental consideration, but this centrality of how climate change and peace and stability and human security interact is core to how we address the security issues of our communities. So my name is Janani Vivekananda. Thank you so much for the introduction, and I'm really delighted to be here today. It's such an honor. So in the next 30 minutes or so, I'd like to talk you through the central question of what's happening when it comes to the implications of climate change on security, so that you, as security personnel, have a better understanding of what you can do in your roles as firefighters, as police, as environmental police, to better address some of the new challenges ahead. So here's how I'll structure it. I will start with some insights, 6 insights on the links between climate change, peace, and security. Then I'll talk about what to do about them, and then if there's any questions or clarifications, I'm really happy to pick them up, or maybe in a coffee break after this session. Is my pace okay? I know that some of you are listening through translation. Is it fine? Okay. Okay, so when it comes to understanding these risks, I'm speaking about the ways in which climate change affects human security. So I'm not saying that climate change has a direct causal link to conflict or insecurity, but rather it's affecting human security, which is essentially beyond physical security. From conversations this morning, I understand that this is a concept which is central to the Ministry of Interior's approach to security. It's beyond the physical security of the state, but it's about understanding the security of people and communities. And this means understanding the implications on all these dimensions that make up people's security, their economic security, their livelihood security, their food security, their physical security, basically their right to live and work with dignity and in safety. So it's not that climate change is the only risk we're facing. Of course, climate change is one of many global pressures alongside things like non-climate related environmental degradation through human impact, population growth, changes in demographic movement through mobility, urbanization. These are all interacting global pressures, and they interact then with existing societal risks, existing political risks, economic and social risks, to have these compound implications on these different dimensions of human security. And I'll talk you through these risks. And here in the Mediterranean region, the impacts of climate change are stark. The region is growing, is heating 20% faster than the global average. This means that the projected impacts of climate change in this region include, as I'm sure you're very well aware, more droughts. They include more frequent and intense wildfires. They include significant sea level rise, which for coastal cities like Barcelona are going to present significant tolls on human security. And as climate change worsens, grievances, tensions, regional security are also at risk. So security actors are increasingly aware of the impacts of climate change in the Mediterranean region. And there's actually a lot more support happening around not just climate change mitigation, but also in disaster relief by a number of security actors in the region. But in this input, I want to focus on the kind of the interior security issues facing this region. And I want to identify the current drivers of these climate change implications on these human security drivers, particularly in Catalonia, but I'm going to speak more generally, looking at some of the global trends. So I'll set out these 6 insights, maybe 7. So the first insight is that the risks posed by climate change are real, they're present, and they are compound. This might seem very, very obvious, but I think it's really important to restate this. It's not a problem of the future. It's not a problem of tomorrow. These impacts are already happening. The drought that's been declared in the Catalonian region just in August is the worst in 20 years. This isn't something for tomorrow. This isn't something for your children's children. This is already happening now. And we need to understand these risks in order to better anticipate them, to do no harm, to ensure that our responses or your responses as security providers don't inadvertently worsen the risks of the future. By addressing forest fires, you're not kind of worsening groundwater scarcity, which then further drives and contributes to the soil degradation of the region. Prevent them where possible, because there is a role that security actors can play in prevention of worsening climate risk, and also to respond when we're too late to prevent. The second insight is that climate change impacts have an effect on competition over natural resources, things like land and water and forests. The resources that many people, particularly in the agricultural sector, build their livelihoods around. And under certain conditions, impacts such as drought and more intense rainfall, these can change the availability to and access to these natural resources. So I want to stress that it's not just about scarcity. We know that there's going to be a stress on these resources, but this doesn't need to lead to grievances. It's about how this change in availability and access to more scarce or more variable natural resources are governed. And this can be politicized, this can cause grievances, this can cause tensions between different users, between, say, small-scale farmers and large-scale farmers, or between agriculturalists and farmers that have livestock, or between the agricultural community and environmentalists. They have different interests, and this can be put under increasing stress as the availability to and access to natural resources face additional strain in the face of climate change. And in some contexts, this can lead to conflict. I'm not saying that this is going to happen here in Catalonia, but it's not uncommon. I mean, a lot of my work is looking at these risks in more fragile contexts in the world, places like Niger or northern Kenya, where there is then a concomitant increase in violent conflict, where people can't resolve these disputes through formal structures, through the courts or through the police. But where the police is not able to address some of these increasing natural resource disputes, then it does lead to increased conflict, and this can be violent conflict in some contexts. So this is what we're facing here on the Iberian Peninsula. It's not looking good. This is the drought as of April 2023. And I don't know how well you can see, but almost the whole region is in warning, and much of it is in alert stage. And just to give an example of how these issues can be politicized, we saw, if we go down to the south, I'll remove myself from the challenges of Catalonia, but in the municipal elections in Andalusia in May, the water stress facing Doñana National Park became a real political issue around these elections. And the way that these resources were managed was kind of used by different political parties representing different groups. And this isn't, I'm not taking a political position at all, but it just shows how these things are not simply environmental issues. You know, that the needs of the farmers in the region were represented by one political party, and then of course there were different norms, and so we saw this then we saw Madrid, Andalusia, and Brussels coming together in quite a heated dispute over the summer, with different interests and different short-term and long-term needs in terms of the water management, people's livelihoods, and the long-term ecological sustainability of this, really important national park, coming at odds with each other. I was in the region in December, and I spoke to farmers in the region who used Doñana's wetlands for their livelihoods, and they were really devastated. They could see that the increasing water scarcity is affecting their livelihoods. I spoke to one farmer whose name was Domingo Toro, and he said that he owns cattle, he needs it to rain, and the grass hasn't grown because it's not raining, and so the seedlings haven't grown. And he knows that he needs water for the grass, for his livestock, and he's tapping it from an aquifer, a small informal well. He knows that this is not a sustainable solution, but it's what he can do to protect his livelihood. And he was going to vote for whoever was going to allow his well to be legal. However, if this was universalized, this wouldn't be sustainable. And he could see that. He could see that his actions were not actually in the long-term interest. And then, of course, there's the environmental campaigners and the EU and Brussels saying, this support of the small-scale farmers to access water in the short run is actually illegal. It's not something that can be done and needs to be prohibited. So there's some real challenges around how to govern this in an equitable and legitimate way, but is also addressing the long-term issues as well as the short-term ones. And this means bringing people alongside and on board. And this is just to show where we are, and I think you can see here Catalonia. This shows areas hit by drought, again, as of April 23, and the amount of the share of land affected by drought in the region in Catalonia is 85.6%. So, and I think this has worsened with the dry summer. The third insight is the impact of climate change on livelihoods, which then affects mobility and people's choices of livelihoods. So climate impacts on jobs, particularly in largely agrarian economies, in agricultural parts of the region, become, as climate makes these livelihoods less and less viable, it can push people to move from rural communities into cities. It can push people to change jobs, look for non-agricultural jobs, and often when people move, they are moving to informal settlements in cities or urban centres, or if they're moving to a different livelihood, if there aren't jobs available, they may be moving into kind of the black market. They might be looking at informal jobs or jobs or look to criminality or organized crime, not because they're criminals, but because there are no alternatives or there are fewer alternatives, and they don't have the training or the alternative avenues for alternative livelihoods. And in my work in international development, this is something that people think about a lot, how to provide alternative livelihoods for people whose work is no longer viable in the face of climate change. But I think increasingly this is something we're having to think about here in Europe. Like, we can't think about an agricultural sector remaining as it was, and we need to think about how we can retrain the next generations to be, to have livelihoods to go into, as climate change makes agriculture less and less of an option. The fourth insight here, actually, I just want to go back to this and say when it comes to, sorry, I'm getting the wrong way. Just on this, the point about human mobility. Very often we hear about people moving because of climate change. And often this narrative is slightly kind of alarmist. Climate change means that people are going to come from Africa, North Africa, into Europe. They're going to, come on small boats and take our jobs or whatever. But what we don't see the evidence for this. Most movement of people caused or contribute, where climate change contributes, is internal, within countries. It's mostly from rural communities into urban centers. Some people do cross borders, but it's a very small minority, and this isn't the trend that we see in the climate-induced mobility literature. So I just wanted to stress that. And so the solution isn't about kind of building walls. It's really about understanding the drivers of this mobility and addressing some of the kind of the livelihood stresses for these communities in their host, in the destination context, as well as where they're coming from. The fourth insight is around food security. So climate change is affecting, obviously, food, the ability to grow food, and has a huge impact on food prices. Perhaps the most well-documented example of this was in 2008, where we had food riots all around the world because the food prices spiked to a point that made a loaf of bread unaffordable for many people around the world. Now, this was because there was a drought in Russia and a drought in China, two of the world's biggest wheat producers, at the same time. And also at the same time, there was a policy by the European Union to try to address and mitigate climate change by switching to biofuels. And so this meant that the EU rapidly was switching from growing crops for food to growing crops for fuel. And so, of course, this reduced the availability of grain for food and land for food production, which again reduced the supply of food, increased the price. And we saw violent riots and deaths, and many people say that this was also a significant trigger of the Arab Spring. So here we can see this dynamic of the impacts of climate change on agriculture. It's not about the availability, it's how it affects food prices, which is a governance issue, and then when people are not able to afford basic foodstuffs like oil and bread, there's often a very strong backlash to governance mechanisms. The fifth insight is around extreme weather events. So basically, a natural disaster, a climate shock, whether it's a long-term stress like drought or a sudden one like a flash flood, this can really challenge governance efficacy and legitimacy. So basically, if a government isn't seen to be able to provide its basic service, which is safeguarding the physical security of people, then this can undermine their legitimacy. So in the face of a disaster, if the government isn't able to keep people safe, this can be a real strain. But the converse is also true. We've really seen that when in the face of a disaster, governance providers, particularly because the security personnel are sometimes the first responders in a disaster, and where they are seen to respond in an effective way, in an equitable way, and in a timely way, then this can really reinforce the legitimacy of a governance institution. And this is very interesting in some contexts which are somewhat fragile, or where the governance providers are not seen to be legitimate. We saw this in Indonesia, in Aceh after the tsunami in 2004, where there was an armed group which was controlling the region, the GAM, the Free Aceh Movement. And prior to the tsunami, they were not seen as a legitimate political actor. But because their response to the tsunami, they were in fact seen as terrorists, but the response to the tsunami was so effective, and they really showed their governance capabilities and addressed the needs of the communities in Aceh, that then meant that the GAM, the Free Aceh Movement, was brought to the negotiation table by the international community after this. So their response to the disaster showed their legitimacy amongst the people and the international community, and made them seen as as competent and acceptable governance representatives for this for the peace process, and it eventually did lead to a sustainable and stable peace in the region. So extreme weather events can challenge governance legitimacy, but it could also help build community trust in security institutions. It can help bring people on board if there are minority groups who don't have much faith in the police or the security apparatus. Then a positive response in the face of a disaster can actually help build that kind of social contract and that trust. The sixth insight, we're almost there, is not about climate change, actually. It's about our responses to climate change, be they adaptation responses or mitigation responses or security responses. But when they might be designed in a way that doesn't take account of human security or people's climate resilience, they can actually carry their own risks of being destabilizing. A bit like the example I shared with you about the European Union's efforts to switch to renewable energy in 2008, inadvertently having a negative impact on food prices, which caused a lot of hunger and violence. Unintended consequences of poorly designed climate and security policies can also carry their own risks. So our responses need to really be cognizant not just of the environmental impacts now, but also the longer term environmental and climate considerations of the next 5, 10, 20 years, particularly for long-term strategies like infrastructure projects, where something's going to be locked in for decades. And the final insight, 7, is that these risks are particularly significant where governance mechanisms are weak or failing. Now, in this region, this isn't relevant, but it can be the case for certain communities. So for some people within this region, there could be a perception that the security and governance mechanisms aren't for them. And in the face of climate change, these grievances and these perceptions can be compounded as they feel that they're increasingly being excluded from some of these security governance processes. So that's what we know, and this is based on kind of the global perspective of climate impacts on peace and human security, but also trying to make it applicable to the context that we're facing here in the Mediterranean region, but also in Catalonia. But what then do we do about it? What I hope I've been able to convey is that the links between climate change and human security don't just imperil kind of security apparatus and delay training exercises when it's too hot to take cadets out to train. Climate change is already undermining human security. It's undermining livelihoods of vulnerable communities, agricultural communities, and it's compounding these risks, these existing risks and existing grievances that many people are facing. This means that security actors need to plan for new contingencies, to be prepared to undertake more frequent disaster response missions, which are more expensive. This is going to be a cost that, say, firefighters are having to absorb. There's new challenges of anticipating kind of more intense weather events where our historic models just aren't able to give us the kind of predictions that we need. There needs to be more absorptive capacity or surge capacity amongst the security apparatus to respond to the variability and the unpredictability of the climate shocks that we're likely to face. And we need to better manage some of the resource stress in some of the communities which will see migration as a result of climate, where kind of rural livelihoods are no longer viable. So to that end, what do we do about it? Well, as security folk, I think the first thing I need to say is mitigation, kind of greening your house, and climate-proofing infrastructure, climate-proofing, or changing the behaviors and decisions being made to ensure that they are as green as possible. Even small things, we talked about it, I talked about it with the team here yesterday, things like insulating buildings and, looking at the physical institutions and equipment that are already there, thinking about what to invest in going forward that will be greener, just making different choices from, single-use plastics within your bureaucracies, and changing lunch menus so that they contain less meat. Small things like this to just bring about kind of small institutional changes that will contribute to having a greener security, public security apparatus. But beyond that, 4 quick points of actions. One is about having the right tools. The future is not going to look like the past, so we need to have better climate models and to support local scenario building with monitoring and early warning systems for climate-related hazards. And I know that some of these exist, but these need to be human, people-centered. They have to include people alongside the climate models to understand what the impacts of these climate risks will be on the people that we're trying to safeguard. So kind of human-centered or people-centered climate change modeling tools. The second is exploring the role that security personnel, the police, the environmental police, the firefighters, exploring the roles that they can play. They're at the coalface. You're at the coalface. You're engaging these communities. What role can you play in supporting local action to address community needs whilst also fostering long-term environmental resilience through kind of behavioral changes? So people don't just understand what the rules are and understand when they're breaking them, but also understand why and what kind of changes need to happen and what alternatives are, because people need to know what the alternative is. Otherwise they have to keep drilling illegally for water because they have no alternative if that's the only way to sustain a livelihood. So what could this be? It could include assessing and supporting local action to remediate climate-affected environments. It could be to encourage green infrastructure amongst local building developments. It could be around water management and regeneration of landscapes and kind of encouraging biodiversity in people's gardens. Oh, sure. Is it working now? No? Yes? Can you hear me at the back? Yes? Okay, I'll carry on. Just 2 more points. Then the third point is around, as I mentioned, there's going to be more mobility, so understanding what this means in terms of more climate resilient cities and subnational areas by developing technical skills to address climate-related issues around managing the water, energy, food nexus in these spaces, and ensuring that there are livelihoods that people can move into in these communities to avoid kind of a peri-urban ring of informal settlements where people are already displaced by climate change and then doubly vulnerable because, as I heard, that they're often living in floodplains, for example, because this is the only place that is left to inhabit. Yes, getting ahead of the additional climate risks of kind of the increased numbers of people that are likely to move into cities and subnational areas in the region. And the fourth is around looking more broadly. So there's, I understand, a lot of thinking around this, and from what I know, I was really, really heartened to hear how here there's a human security-centered approach to public security, which is very new to me. I don't think many countries or regions have this. And of course, these challenges of climate security are global. And so given this global nature of the risks, there's a real role of kind of promoting greater cooperation, sharing this human security approach, which seems very practical in terms of how you're operationalizing it across the different arms of the public security apparatus, and sharing this through knowledge sharing and technical exchanges. I know this is done at a technical level, and Anna was telling me she's going to go to Berlin and share this with firefighters in Berlin, but also this conceptual side. I think this is something really important to share across other regions and also other countries, as well as some of the more technical points around cross-border and cross-community land restoration and joint early warning systems and disaster risk reduction cooperation. So, the very, very local level action as well as the global piece. So, I'll leave it there. I've been really inspired to hear about the really great work that everyone's involved in here, and also the really exciting opportunities around this human security-centered approach and putting climate change at the center of this conference today. So I'm honored to be here. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for listening. Good morning.